Neville walked into the kitchen and dumped the groceries on the table, his eyes moving to the clock. 20 minutes to 6. Soon now. He poured a little water into a small pan and clanked it down on a stove burner. Next, he thawed out the chops and put them under the broiler. By this time, the water was boiling, and he dropped in the frozen string beans and covered them, thinking that it was probably the electric stove that was milking the generator. At the table, he sliced himself 2 pieces of bread and poured himself a glass of tomato juice. He sat down and looked at the red second hand as it swept slowly around the clock face. The bastards ought to be here soon. After he'd finished his tomato juice, he walked to the front door and went out onto the porch. He stepped off onto the lawn and walked down to the sidewalk. The sky was darkening and it was getting chilly. He looked up and down Cimarron Street, the cool breeze ruffling his blond hair. That's what was wrong with these cloudy days. You never knew when they were coming. Oh well, at least they were better than those damn dust storms. With a shrug, he moved back across the lawn and into the house, locking and bolting the door behind him, sliding the thick bar into place. Then he went back into the kitchen, turned his chops, and switched off the heat under the string beans. He was putting the food on his plate when he stopped and his eyes moved quickly to the clock. 6:25 today. Ben Cortman was shouting. "Come out, Neville!" Robert Neville sat down with a sigh and began to eat. He sat in the living room trying to read. He'd made himself a whiskey and soda at his small bar, and he held the cold glass as he read a physiology text. From the speaker over the hallway door, the music of Schoenberg was playing loudly. Not loudly enough, though. He still heard them outside, their murmuring, and their walkings about, and their cries, their snarling and fighting amongst themselves. Once in a while a rock or brick thudded off the house. Sometimes a dog barked. And they were all there for the same thing. Robert Neville closed his eyes a moment and held his lips in a tight line. Then he opened his eyes and lit another cigarette, letting the smoke go deep into his lungs. He wished he'd had time to soundproof the house. It wouldn't be so bad if it weren't that he had to listen to them. Even after 5 months, it got on his nerves. He never looked at them anymore. In the beginning, he'd made a peephole in the front window and watched them. But then the woman had seen him and started striking vile postures in order to entice him out of the house. He didn't want to look at that. He put down his book and stared bleakly at the rug. Hearing Virgil Knock play over the loudspeaker, he knew he could put plugs in his ears to shut off the sound of them. But that would shut off the music too, and he didn't want to feel that they were forcing him into a shell. He closed his eyes again. It was the woman who made it so difficult. Bethought the woman posing like lewd puppets in the night on the possibility that he'd see them and decide to come out. A shudder ran through him. Every night it was the same. He'd be reading and listening to his music, then he'd start to think about soundproofing the house. Then he'd think about the woman. Deep in his body the nodding heat began again, and he pressed his lips together until they were white. He knew the feeling well, and it enraged him that he couldn't combat it. It grew and grew until he couldn't sit still anymore. Then he'd get up and pace the floor, fists bloodless at his sides. Maybe he'd set up the movie projector or eat something or have too much to drink or turn the music up so loud it hurt his ears. He had to do something when it got really bad. He felt the muscles of his abdomen closing in like frightening coils. He picked up the book and tried to read, his lips forming each word slowly and painfully. But in a moment, the book was on his lap again. He looked at the bookcase across from him. All the knowledge in those books couldn't put out the fires in him. All the words of centuries couldn't end the wordless, mindless craving of his flesh. The realization made him sick. It was an insult to a man. All right, it was a natural drive, but there was no outlet for it any more. They'd forced celibacy on him. He'd have to live with it. You have a mind, don't you? He asked himself. Well, use it. He reached over and turned the music still louder, then forced himself to read a whole page without pause. He read about blood cells being forced through membranes, about pale lymph carrying the waste through tubes blocked by lymph nodes, about lymphocytes and phagocytic cells. To empty in the left shoulder region near the thorax into a large vein of the blood circulating system. The book shut with a thud. Why didn't they leave him alone? Did they think they could all have him? Were they so stupid they thought that? Why did they keep coming every night? After 5 months, you'd think they'd give up and try elsewhere. He went over to the bar and made himself another drink. As he turned back to his chair, he heard stones rattling down across the roof and landing with thuds in the shrubbery beside the house. Above the noises, he heard Ben Cortlandt shout, as he always shouted, "Come out, Neville!" Some day I'll get that bastard, he thought, as he took the big swallow of a bitter drink. Someday I'll knock a stake right through his goddamn chest. I'll make one a foot long for him. A special ones with ribbons on it. The bastard. Tomorrow he'd soundproof the house. His fingers drew into white-knuckled fists. He couldn't stand thinking about those women. If he didn't hear them, maybe he wouldn't think about them. Tomorrow. The music ended, and he took the stack of records off the turntable and slid them back into the cardboard envelopes. Now he could hear them, even more clearly outside. He reached for the first new record he could get and put it on the turntable, and twisted the volume up to its highest point. The Year of the Plague by Robert Lee filled his ears. Violins scraped and whined. Timpani thudded like the beats of a dying heart. Flutes played weird, atonal melodies. With a stiffening of rage, he wrenched up the record and snapped it over his right knee. He'd meant to break it long ago. He walked on rigid legs to the kitchen and flung the pieces into the trash box. Then he stood in the dark kitchen, eyes tightly shut, teeth clenched, hands damped over his ears. Leave me alone, leave me alone, leave me alone. No use. You couldn't beat them at night. No use trying. It was their special time. He was acting very stupidly, trying to beat them. Should he watch a movie? No, he didn't feel like setting up the projector. He'd go to bed and put the plugs in his ears. It was what he ended up doing every night anyway. Quickly, trying not to think at all, he went to the bedroom and undressed. He put on the pajama bottoms and went into the bathroom. He never wore pajama tops. It was a habit he'd acquired in Panama during the war. As he washed, he looked down into the mirror at his broad chest, at the dark hair swirling around the nipples and down the center line of his chest. He looked at the ornate cross he'd tattooed on his chest one night in Panama when he'd been drunk. What a fool I was in those days, he thought. Well, maybe that cross had saved his life. He brushed his teeth carefully and used dental floss. He tried to take good care of his teeth because he was his own dentist now. Some things could go to pot, but not his health, he thought. Then why don't you stop pouring alcohol into yourself, he thought. Why don't you shut the hell up, he thought. Now he went through the house, turning out lights. For a few minutes he looked at the mural and tried to believe it was really the ocean. But how could he believe it with all the bumpings and scrapings, the howlings and snarlings and cries in the night? He turned off the living room lamp and went into the bedroom. He made a sound of disgust when he saw the sawdust covered his bed. He brushed it off with snapping hand strokes, thinking that he'd better build a partition between the shop and the sleeping portion of the room. Better to do this and better to do that, he thought morosely. There were so many damn things to do, he'd never get to the real problem. He jammed in his earplugs, and a great silence engulfed him. He turned off the light and crawled in between the sheets. He looked at the radium-faced clock and saw that it was only a few minutes past 10. Just as well, he thought. This way I'll get an early start. He lay there, on the bed, and took a deep breath of the darkness, hoping for sleep. But the silence didn't really help. He could still see them out there, the white-faced men prowling around the house, looking ceaselessly for a way to get in at him. Some of them probably crouching on their haunches like dogs, eyes glittering at the house, teeth slowly grating together, back and forth, back and forth. And the women. Did he have to start thinking about them again? He tossed over on his stomach with a curse and pressed his face into the hot pillow. He lay there, breathing heavily, body writhing slowly on the sheet. Let the morning come. His mind spoke the words if it spoke every night. Dear God, let the morning come. He dreamed about Virginia, and he cried out in his sleep, and his fingers gripped the sheets like frenzied talons.